I'm Joshua Hanlon here at the First Battle of Manassas Battlefield here in Virginia. It's about 45 minutes outside of Washington, D.C., so if you're in the area, very easy to stop on by and check everything out here. It's a great battlefield. Behind me, you can see the memorial that was put up by Union forces in 1865 after the Civil War ended, and it commemorates all of the Union soldiers who fell here. Interesting note about names here at Manassas. So the Confederates called this battlefield Manassas because of the town called Manassas that's near here. The Union troops called this Bull Run because of the Bull Run Creek or river that runs through here. So depending on which side you're reading from, on the memorial erected by the Union troops, it says in memory of the soldiers who fell at Bull Run because it was put up by Union troops, but the park is actually called the Manassas Battlefield Park. This marker that is to my right here is the location of General Bernard Bee's death during the First Battle of Manassas. General Bernard Bee is a lesser known figure from Civil War history, but he is famous for one thing, and that's giving this man, whose statue you see over here, his name. Bernard Bee, during the battle, saw General Jackson with his troops, the Virginians, and told his men, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally behind the Virginians." And so General Bernard Bee, though he died at this battle, during it gave General Jackson his name that now everyone knows him by, Stonewall Jackson. And that's who you see here in this very muscular looking statue. Both General Jackson and the horse look very muscular. It almost looks like Superman stuffed into a Civil War uniform there. So not quite totally historically accurate, but definitely giving that great commander pose there with the horse and Stonewall Jackson. So a little bit of history tied closely together here at the First Battle of Manassas. Commanders here on each side they were very inexperienced, had only commanded about 30 troops each in the past during the Mexican-American War, the Union commander or the Confederate commander, and so they had very little experience coming in. Each side had about 30,000 troops, so they went from commanding no more than 30 troops to 30,000 during the Civil War here, which was just really amazing how much more they had to take on there. Soldiers were very inexperienced as well. A lot of volunteers here at the First Battle of Manassas, and so these soldiers were not veterans in any way and had pretty much no experience at all fighting. So that kind of sets the battle up. It was July 21st in 1861, which was a Sunday, and so you actually had observers coming in after church. Some civilians came in from the surrounding area and nearby hills, were actually observing what was going on during the battle, just to get information and figure out what happened during the battle. An interesting point here, I am located on Henry Hill. Behind me here, you can see in the hills in the distance is where the Union forces first came from. And so they came over those hills and pushed the Confederate forces back actually to the Henry Hill area here, which leads up to the area that I'm standing in now, which here next to me is a cemetery. And if you look at the tallest tombstone in the middle there, it's for Judith Henry, who was the first civilian casualty of the war. Her house was here to the left that you can see recreated right here. This was her farmhouse that she lived in. During the First Battle of Manassas, she was old and almost blind. She was basically bedridden. And when the Union artillery moved into position, which you can see off in the distance there toward the visitor center here, you can see some of those artillery pieces. The Union moved those artillery into position and then started taking fire from small arms fire, and so the Union artillery commander could not figure out what was going on, and then finally figured out that there were Confederate sharpshooters in the farmhouse here that were picking off his artillery soldiers, and so he moved 2 of his cannons and began firing on the farmhouse here. Well, he did not realize that Judith Henry was inside there at the time. He thought he was just clearing the building of the sharpshooters, and so by clearing out the sharpshooters, he killed Judith Henry, and the first civilian casualty of the war took place. But obviously, the artillery commander did not realize she was in there at the time, so this is just an unfortunate casualty of war. And as I mentioned, this is her tombstone. She's buried here today. So kind of really brings it all home as far as the casualties here at the First Battle of Manassas. There were 5,000 total casualties between both sides during the battle, and this was just far worse than anyone thought it would be. Like I mentioned, all of these soldiers, they didn't have experience. They hadn't even seen a photograph of a dead soldier before, and so they saw all this carnage on the battlefield, and many of them were just blown away by it and couldn't believe what they were seeing. And especially a lot of them thought that the war would be over shortly, like it'd be one big battle and that'd be it, and then the war would be over. But as we know, it continued on for several more years. So lots of fascinating history here at the battlefield of Manassas to check out. Inside the house is actually an interesting 3D movie that they've set up that shows photographs and stuff shortly after the battle. And so it kind of shows what everything around Manassas here looked like. Now we're at the site of the largest Union attack during the Second Battle of Manassas, which took place roughly about 13 months after the First Battle of Manassas in August of 1862. And this is an interesting part of the battlefield here, which runs all along the deep cut, which was where the Confederate defenders were holding out against the Union forces. And it was the deep cut because this was the area of a planned railroad that was going through here, and so there was basically about an 8-foot deep trench in some areas where the railroad was going to be put through here, but it hadn't been laid yet, so it was just a trench in a lot of areas. Some areas where the ground was level with it, then there wasn't much of a trench because they didn't need to level it out at all, so it just depended on where you were in the Confederate forces as far as how deep the trench was. But this area right here is really interesting because if you look down at the ground, you can see how rocky it is. And this was actually the site of a brief rock fight where Confederate troops from Louisiana spent a couple of minutes throwing rocks at Union forces when they ran out of ammunition. So they picked up these rocks here like this and were throwing them this direction out into the open field there. You can see where the Union forces were coming from the woods from that direction. So kind of a really interesting episode there. It was only for a couple of minutes until reinforcements came up and those troops were replaced and they brought in new ammunition and everything. But just one of those little sort of mythical episodes of war almost. The troops immediately started talking about how they drove back basically the whole Union forces with rocks, which obviously is not true, but it immediately became almost mythical within the history of the Confederate forces here at the Second Battle of Manassas, and is an interesting episode from the Second Battle. Thanks for watching our video on the Manassas battlefields here in Virginia. One of the things I love is there's so much great stuff on display, like these cannons here, the recreated buildings, and so much other neat stuff to see here at the Manassas battlefields. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. There's also a couple of great apps you can get that as you drive around the battlefields give you lots of good information. So look for those in the App Store, search Bull Run or Manassas, and you'll be able to find those. Lots of really great history here. If you're interested in Civil War history or American history really at all, this is a must-hit battlefield to see really where the Civil War started in the first major battle of the Civil War. Thanks for watching.